Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week, I kick off a new series talking about one of my favorite games and settings, BattleTech. Now, there's a little bit of a joke among us longtime fans of BattleTech. The joke is that it is the game that the cockroaches will be playing after nuclear annihilation occurs. This is because, well, one, most of us are from the 80s when the game started, or many of us are from the 80s, and, you know, back then, the threat of nuclear annihilation was a constant threat. But also, there's the fact that the game line has survived so many attempts to destroy it. You know, first, it started off as battle droids, and got slapped with legal action by Lucas. So they changed it to BattleTech. Then they got multiple lawsuits by this little real estate company called Harmony Gold. You might be familiar with them. They did the American localization for a little thing called Robotech. And these lawsuits are just a complicated mess. I'm not even going to go into them because, frankly, they give me a headache just trying to figure out everything that went on with them. You know, then, of course, you have the fact that the original company that made it closed, sold BattleTech to WizKids. WizKids was bought out by was eventually bought out by Topps, a trading card company. And then Topps licensed producing the classic BattleTech to a company called FanPro. FanPro hit some issues, went under. A bunch of the people who worked at FanPro formed a company called Catalyst Game Labs that got licensed to continue making the games. It's hit a number of snags over the years, including more stuff from Harmony Gold, which thankfully shouldn't be a problem anymore since the last suit was dismissed with prejudice against Harmony Gold. In theory, that's good, but it's time for us to talk about BattleTech, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. When talking about BattleTech, it's kind of tricky to decide where to start talking. In this case, I'm going to start talking at the beginning of the timeline. The history of the world of BattleTech and our world diverges sometime in the 1990s. Specifically when, we don't entirely know. What we do know is that eventually a faction called the Western Alliance would dominate Earth, or as they call it in BattleTech, Terra. And starting in 2018, people began working on a project. This would eventually lead to Project Deimos in 2107. Project Deimos is when the first faster-than-light travel-capable ship launched. This was a testbed ship, the Deimos, and it used the Kearney-Fuchida drive, which the theories for it were stated back in 2018. And this was the ultimate culmination of those theories. And what happened was the Deimos made a jump and came back successfully. And with that, the era of the relativistic suspended animation ships trying to reach nearby stars to colonize was over. Note that by this point, humanity had colonized Mars, and a number of the other major bodies in the solar system. There were O'Neill cylinders built at certain points, etc., etc. You know, the solar system under the Terran Alliance was more or less being colonized and was reaching the limits of what it could handle. So, when the next year after the Deimos did its test run, the Terran Alliance ship Pathfinder launched. That was the start of exploration. And once exploration started, colonization was shortly following. And this is the beginning of BattleTech. Or at least the beginning of the universe as we know it. You see, the Kearney-Fuchida drive basically works by the principle of a ship is here and here simultaneously for a second. And then it stops existing here and starts existing totally here. This has a lot of interesting repercussions. Misjumps are horrible things. If you're lucky, you'll die in the misjump. Because that's how bad misjumps are. From there, the Terran Alliance started colonizing within jump distance or 2 jump distance of Earth. Initially, it was only like 20 light years distance, and eventually it would end up being 60 light years distance would be the maximum of 2 jumps. This is, of course, because as the technology advanced, it improved, etc., etc. And what happened is the Terran Alliance started expanding. And originally, all colonies were under the authority of the Terran Alliance. Now, something to remember is that it takes time to charge up a Kearney-Fuchida drive. So, what this means is the further away you get from Terra, the longer it takes for a ship to get out there. Yes, there was a concept called the command circuit, where you would basically have a ship jump to one location. There's another ship there waiting. Transfer the shuttles or messages to the ship that's waiting. It would then jump, etc., etc. But was really reserved for important instances, important messages. And as you got further away from Terra, it took longer for messages to get out there. It takes, on average, a week to charge a KF drive. And so, once you've got that drive charged, then you can make another jump. And then you have to charge again. And then make a jump. And then charge again. So, as humanity settled, we started getting further and further away from Terra. And it started taking longer and longer. Until certain regions of space started to say, you know what? We don't really think Terra matters to us much anymore. We're going to declare independence. Ostensibly, one of the first of these is what would be called the Free Worlds League. And what ended up happening was the Terran Alliance tried to impose their will by force. That never works very well. So, after they started losing, the Terran Alliance made the fun decision of anything within 2 jumps of us will continue to be under our authority. Anything beyond that, we will no longer send any form of support whatsoever. The theory was that they were going to let these other planets starve and die. Well, that didn't happen. Instead, these other planets began forming their own governments. They formed trade pacts and alliances and became their own governments. Eventually, the Terran Alliance would become the Terran hegemony. This is mostly because of they had some other brief skirmishes and civil disputes, and basically one of their leaders, a admiral by the last name of McKenna, came up with this brilliant idea that he would just bombard a city on Terra from space with battleships and say, yeah, you listen to me now. And it worked. You're probably noticing a slight trend here in BattleTech. That peace is not a big thing. Well, of course, it's BattleTech, not peace tech. And this is where we enter into what is commonly called the Age of War. So, when we talk about the Age of War, we're dealing with 3 key events. Now understand, the Age of War lasted from 2398 to 2550. And it ultimately ends where it begins. See, the first part of the Age of War, the very beginning of it, is the First Sandurian War, fought between the Capellan Confederation and the Free Worlds League. This lasted from 2398 to 2404. And this was more or less the start. And this ushered in the 152 years, more or less, of constant warfare in the Inner Sphere. The Inner Sphere would wage these wars, and technology would begin advancing in leaps and bounds. Because, well, let's face it, historically, nothing causes more development in technology than warfare. But there are other issues that come with warfare, especially unrestricted warfare. And these came to a head fairly early in the Age of War. In 2412, at a little planet called Tintavel. The planet of Tintavel, what the Capellan Confederation and Free Worlds League were fighting for over that world, we don't really know. Much of the details, who attacked it, who held it originally, what they were fighting for, etc., that all has kind of gotten lost over the more important detail of it. The battle escalated. It escalated way out of hand. It escalated to the point where the full suite of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, ships raining fire from orbit down, everything was used. The world itself was effectively sterilized. And the horrors of it just could not be tolerated, well, by either of the two faction leaders. But it was Alicia Liao of the Capellan Confederation who made the actual move to form the Ares Conventions. Historically, there is a parallel to the Ares Conventions. The Hague Conventions on warfare. And basically what this ultimately did, the main purpose of the Ares Conventions was it so heavily restricted the use of nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare to the point that they were pretty much not able to be used on the planet. There were some really, really fine points that some lawyers could probably justify the use of some of these on a planet. But it would be really, really tough at the boards of inquiry to defend it. They banned fighting in a city. In fact, they restricted fighting to be away from civilian centers. This meant that it was unlikely that you were going to destroy a farm, or at least unlikely that you were going to destroy a planet's ability to support itself in warfare. They heavily restricted the use of orbital bombardment to the point where it had to have a lot of really specific criteria to be able to be used. And the unintentional side effect was that it made war palatable. It made war almost ritualized. You know, a case of the invaders would land on a planet, the defenders would go out to meet them at a safe area. They'd fight, and then either the defenders would be destroyed, or the attackers would be destroyed or withdraw. And that was pretty much how warfare went for a long time. And the key note for this is why warfare was so common. Because it was clean. It was an acceptable way to deal with political obstacles. And then we come to 2439. 2439 is the defining moment for BattleTech. 2439 is when the first battle mech was developed. This was the Mackie. And the first Mackie utterly dominated the battlefield. The first test had one Mackie engage a company of heavy tanks and take them out. And the thing you have to understand is battle mechs were revolutionary. Battle mechs are 20 feet tall walking tanks. They are what you think of when you think of BattleTech. They are the things like the Warhammer, the Atlas, the Dire Wolf from later centuries. All of these things. And they have special armor that can take damage that would just destroy utterly anything else. Their armor causes damage to slough off, and hit with a laser, it melts and runs. Hit with an autocannon, it shatters outward, absorbing portions of the impact. Tanks, in order to have the same effect, have to have much, much thicker armors. Because BattleTech armor just doesn't really work well on a tank. Just because of how tanks are built. But eventually, tank armor would reach a point where it was comparable to mech armor. And then, eventually, technology would progress to where tanks were able to use mech armor. But, initially, a battle mech against a company of tanks, one mech against 12 tanks, the mech was going to walk away. The tanks, not so much. And it was this event that defines BattleTech as we know it. Because this created the king of the battlefield. A good chunk of the next few decades is the proliferation of battle mechs into the other great houses. Different factions would take different approaches to get them. But ultimately, it all boiled down to they somehow got them from the Terran hegemony. Either they stole them from the Terran hegemony, or they stole them from somebody who stole them from the hegemony. Or they salvaged them from somebody and then reverse engineered them. All those little details. But as the Age of War continued, it does have to end eventually. And it ends in 2550. Now, the events surrounding the end of the Age of War are interesting. You see, the Terran hegemony is running into an issue. It doesn't want to have to rely on imports of raw materials from the other great houses, but it's run out of the easily mined materials. Or it's running out of. Ian Cameron sees that there's probably less than 100 years. And so he begins plans. He wants to create a new uniting body for humanity. And he's given an important step in this when the Capellan Confederation and Free Worlds League are again at war for the planet of Andorian. He steps in and he begins to negotiate. And he is able to negotiate a peace. But the important thing here is that Ian Cameron makes an ally of Captain General Albert Merrick of the Free Worlds League. With Merrick's help, he is able to sway the other great houses. and a treaty is eventually signed. This treaty brings into being the Star League. And on July 9th, 2571, Ian Cameron ceases to be the Director General of the Terran Hegemony and becomes the First Lord of the Star League. From that moment, the BattleTech universe changes forever. And in fact, everything that will come in the future comes from this one man's crowning moment, the achievement of his dream. And next week, I will talk about the Star League. Until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.